You want to know what the next hot, cool thing is? I know we've talked about NFTs. I know we've talked about crypto. I know we talked about, sending GameStop to the moon and rescuing AMC theaters. The next cool thing, though,
we love the cubes, folks.
No, it's like we're going to live in cubes and we're going to look at the cubes in the cubes.
It's the dawn
of the cube.
Of the age of cubes.
I keep it on my desk as a reminder of what motivates me. Keep going. Keep working, said Mr. Morris, who also invests in cryptocurrencies. One day, I'll be able to upgrade to a larger size cube. Oh, man. I feel I mean, I'd laugh if it wasn't so sad, but I feel pity for all these broke boys out there with small-ass cubes on their desks. Lately, photos of smoked brisket have given away to pictures of cubes.
There's only so much meat you can smoke before you go, what am I doing? This is hollow. It's just this. And then your mystification is lifted when you realize, oh, I could be caring about cubes. Like, these guys' money is in a digital wallet somewhere. You can't put that on Instagram, but you can put a dope-ass cube out there.
I'm going to be buried with my cube, probably, said Mr. Agrawal. It will be like a pharaoh buried with his possessions, so the cube will have a place of honor. Cube enthusiasts often describe them in quasi-mystical terms. There is a rallying cry. We like the cube. We like the cube. We like the cube. We like the cube. Buy an NFT, and you can visit the cube once a year. That's two stories about our exciting cube-based future.
I'm ready for it. I'm ready to eat cubes, collect them, live in one. It's all going to be good.
What would you do if you, on Christmas or the new winter cube holiday?
The cube solstice.
Getting a cube solstice. What if instead of, getting a new cube as you expected, your beloved, your spouse, got you a sphere? What would you do?
Oh, my God. Oh, the cube solstice is going to be a great holiday, though, because what's the perfect shape for fitting down chimneys? Cubes. Just Father Cube drops cubes down the chimney of all good boys and girls.
Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy. I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, begrudging TC Tugsman Maddox.
I'm sorry, I'm not a huge Halloween costume
You're
guy.
allowed to begrudge it. I'm not either. I mean, truthfully, I have been on the hunt for what I want to be like my dad Halloween costume. Not that I will dress up as a dad, but you know how dads sometimes have their one Halloween costume and that's what they are every single year? I guarantee your dad has never dressed up for Halloween in your lifetime.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
That might explain where I got my proclivity to not dress up.
Yeah, my dad, honestly, I can't picture him in a costume. I don't think he ever dressed up either, but there were definitely neighborhood dads in my neighborhood growing up where it was like every year, Mr. Goodman is a race car driver or whatever because he got one nice costume. For a long time, I wanted a high-quality, the next generation bridge outfit in wool garbadine, the high-quality ones. They're extraordinarily expensive. I can't justify the cost. This year, I figured, you know what? Go to Michael's, get a yellow t-shirt, get a knob, put the knob on the front, boom, TC Tugger.
And everyone got it right.
One person got it. Exactly one person got it, and this person I called would get it. We asked before the event began, will any of my neighbors get this reference? And I said no, except for Spencer. And Spencer got it. Spencer, if you're listening, good job. Now, Spencer's wife, she looked at it and said, oh, it's the thing. I don't like that.
I don't like that, no.
I don't like that, is what she said. There was also somebody said, that sounds very niche. Somebody else said, that's disgusting.
I think there was a disturbing.
There was a disturbing as well. People did not like the TC Tugger
outfit.
Outfit.
It's really impressive. So the TC Tugger outfit, I'm sure all of our wonderful listeners are also as big of fans as I think you should leave as we are.
Our listeners always take our recommendations, and we've recommended this in the show.
Oh, right. So
times.
they've all watched it.
Yes.
So it's, as you know, it's just a t-shirt with a knob on the front. So, when your shirt gets stuck, you just pull it out. And it's not to be worn ironically. It's a serious thing. Anyway, turns out you can make a t-shirt look so incredibly awkward just with a small knob in the wrong place.
You put one knob right on it, and the rest of your outfit looks normal. People are like, that guy didn't dress up. He's just got a very strange belly button. A super outie, as they call it.
They sure do.
On this week's episode of the show, we are talking about archetypes, right, Anthony? That's what you said you want to talk about.
Yeah, I feel like this is just a big part of cube design that I don't think we've really addressed head on, even though it comes up all the time. Yeah, a lot of draft environments have sort of like predefined structure for the kinds of decks you expect to be there. And I think it's an important thing that we touch on at some point.
Yeah, we don't talk about archetypes a lot, and I think why will become known through our conversation. But before we dive into that salivating topic, we of course have to do a pack one, pick one from a listener-submitted cube. This week's cube is the Face Down Slide, which comes to us from listener Cassie. She writes, I've always loved cycling and Morph's mechanics, but found them weaker than other cube archetypes I've worked with in the past. So, put them together into their own cube, creating an environment where each can shine in its own way. Each mechanic appears in all 5 colors, and all 5 colors have varied sorts of payoffs for each mechanic. Powerful colorless build-arounds fit in any combination as well, meaning the number of unique feeling decks is very high. I expect players will be able to create a synergistic and interesting deck in any given color combination, and that their deck will be very different from the next person who drafts those colors. Anthony, this is a cube kind of near and dear to your heart.
I love it already. I love, honestly, everything about this. First of all, I too love cycling and Morph. I think that lots of Magic players will agree with that. They are just great mechanics. I love the name of this cube, taking those 2 mechanics and turning it into the face down slide, obviously playing off of Astral Slide and the fact that you're going to put a bunch of cards face down. I also love just sort of the depth that's gone into here, into a bunch of creatures that care about Devoid, because you have all these colorless things, and obviously about like cycling and discard in the graveyard. So this is definitely up my alley. And I especially really love that description of doing powerful things with weak cards, because I just think that's such an important part about game design, is the numbers only matter really relative to each other. So if you're, unmorphing a Gathan Raiders and discarding a card that you're then getting a discard trigger off of, like, that's still a powerful thing. I mean, we could define powerful as being like happens on turn 3, which maybe that's not happening. But we can also just define powerful in terms of like, what are the decisions you're making? How cool of an engine have you set up with your Astral Slide? And what kinds of things are you making your deck do?
Hey, even in my very powerful vintage cube, you can win a lot of games by making a strong deck out of weak cards. Vanguard is not a very good card. A 1-mana 2/1, dinky, dies to 1/2 a Fork Bolt.
As many things do.
I will read us the pack then, and we will ride this wave of excitement that's coming off of Anthony to hear what he thinks the number 1 pick is. The pack is Paleoloth, Bane of the Living, Swarm Surge, Evolutionary Leap, Forsake the Worldly, Carrier Thrall, Nature's Lore, Battlefield Forge, Solar Blast, Caves of Koilos, Fluctuator, Backslide, Elspeth Conquers Death, Prismatic Lens, and Neutralize. What is piquing your interest, Anthony?
I mean, Backslide is piquing my interest just being in the perfect bridge card that references both of the theme mechanics. However, I'm not taking unmorph a creature and cycle. I don't think this is really a card that's going to do a lot.
Unmorph a creature or cycle, Anthony. You can't do both.
Oh, I said or.
He said and.
So I'm a little bit disappointed in this pack, I'm going to be honest, because for all the excitement I have for all the things we just talked about and how we can make these weak mechanics feel powerful when they're relative to another field of weaker cards, or, just appropriately scaled cards, Elspeth Conquers Death really stands out as a big power outlier, which it does sort of lean into some of the mechanics in that if you're cycling, you're filling up the graveyard, but I think it's really hard to pass Elspeth Conquers Death. It just generates so much more value and is an extremely powerful card. That being said, if I ignore that and set that aside, Fluctuator is the obvious standout in terms of just really leaning into the mechanics. So it's a 2-mana artifact that makes all your cycling 2 cheaper, so it just gives you free cycling, which that's an exciting...
Not always free cycling, but lots of cards cycle for 2 or less. And so free cycling on a lot of cards, very heavily reduced cycling on some others.
It's going to work on Neutralize here. It's not, unfortunately, going to work on Backslide. But that's the kind of thing that, again, like we've talked about, if we're going into drafting a unique cube one time, we often want to really, try and explore the unique thing and not just spike it. So Fluctuator is really, really appealing. The other things that stand out are Bane of the Living for being a morph card that does a cool effect. It can be extremely powerful, just wiping the board when you unmorph it. And then Nature's Lore also stands out to me as just a ramp spell that I think is going to be pretty powerful in a lower powered environment.
We spent too much time playing Magic together, Anthony, because those are pretty much all the cards I highlighted as well. I will say I don't agree that Elspeth Conquers Death is necessarily a big power outlier. To me, I think the most powerful card in this pack, the safest pick, is just Nature's Lore. Nature's Lore is super strong, and it's going to go in any green deck, and you'll be very happy to run it. Elspeth Conquers Death gets better in slower environments, and based on the goals of this environment, I would expect it to be slower. I would also expect there not to be so many giant haymakers where getting a thing back, kind of ends the game. I know a lot of people in very powerful vintage cube lists, even with power or reanimator decks or sneak and show, stuff like that, really like Elspeth Conquers Death, because a lot of times the thing you get back from the graveyard is just a total game-ending bomb, and the game basically ends on the spot. So it kind of reads almost like an answer, and then also a win condition that's very reliable. Here, I think it's going to be a very strong value play, and I agree it's in the top of the pack. I wouldn't say clearly head and shoulders above the rest. I do think Bane of the Living is really strong. For people that don't know this card, it is 2 black for a 4/3 creature insect. It has morph for X black, so of course you can play this face down for 3 generic mana, or face up as a 4 mana 4/3. And if you play it face down, you can unmorph it for X black. And when you do unmorph it, all creatures get -X till end of turn. So it's a board wipe on a decent sized creature that you can play as a morph, which is, I think, a very powerful effect. If I were trying to do the thing the cube wants me to do, it would be Bane of the Living. I'm not going to take a Fluctuator. I'm very skeptical of what Fluctuator could do in this environment. You're down a card, and then it just makes cycling cheaper. So it's never, ever giving you that card back, ever. It's just going to give you a sort of speed boost to very specific effects that your deck can do. I would want to pair that with specific payoffs. This is really great when you have something like a Drakehaven, where you can maybe cycle a bunch, but you need to cycle and also pay for some effect, and now you can just dedicate all your mana to paying for those triggers and getting those drakes, and not dedicate any mana to actually cycling the cards. But like we said, in this pack, Solar Blast, Backslide, these cards aren't even really made cheaper by Fluctuator. So there's going to be plenty of cycling cards that don't even necessarily work with it. So I'm pretty skeptical of that one. But I'm high on Bane of the Living, I'm high on Nature's Lore, and I also am high on Elspeth Conquers Death.
I'm equally skeptical about Fluctuator. It's definitely, like you said, it's a build around, or it's kind of like an enabler that just only works when you have a really high density plus another payoff. And you need to draw all those cards at the same time. So it definitely is a high ceiling, exciting card that is likely to fail in a lot of ways. But taking it pack 1, I would definitely, if I did talk myself into taking it, take a deep breath and try not to get into the mentality of, if my deck doesn't work, I fell into a trap. Just be like, I tried the thing and it didn't work out.
I thought you were going to say get into a mentality of it's okay if I lose, or I want to stay open and not just force cycling, even though I first pack would pick with a Fluctuator. But you were like, I'm really focus on just not offending this cube designer. No. You can tell that I'm a cube designer.
I'm focusing on me not getting myself tilted. I just want to, at the end of the draft, be like, did I get there? I might even end up taking this pack 1, pick 1, and then just moving off it, realizing that I'm not seeing enough support for it, or everybody else is clearly in the cycling deck, and I should be drafting all morph.
I think it's a really cool cube list, and at the end of the day, if I'm spiking this, I'm just going to take Nature's Lore, and if I'm trying to do what the cube wants me to do, I'm going to take Bane of the Living with a shout-out to Elspeth Conquers Death. That could be the right pick if this environment proves to be slow enough and value-oriented enough.
Yeah, I think that if I'm honest with myself, if I was actually sitting at a real pack in a draft, I would probably be taking Elspeth Conquers Death.
Thank you, Cassie, a.k.a. Bread Wedding, for sending in your cube for a pack 1, pick 1. I'm curious to know if we screwed it up. Is Fluctuator actually a huge bomb here? It could be. Fluctuator could just end up being a bomb with how this cube plays out. Having never played it, having just looked at the list, it's kind of hard to say. So if you think about it, email us, let us know how we did on this pack 1, pick 1. If you want to have your cube dissected on air by Anthony and I in a listener-submitted pack 1, pick 1, send a link to mail@luckypaper.co with your name and pronouns so we can refer to you how you'd like to be referred to. Archetypes, Anthony. What's an archetype?
I'm not familiar with that word. Would you like to try again?
What is an archetype, Anthony? How are you defining this term?
When we're drafting cube decks, or limited decks as well, I think we can't talk about decks in the same way we can in Constructed, where, you're often going to have identical lists, or lists that are off by just a little bit here or there. So I think that the term archetype just comes from, the way it's used in other sort of media, where it's to say, well, this is a kind of deck. It functions sort of in this way, but it's going to look pretty different depending on, draft to draft, player to player.
When you said you want to talk about archetypes, did you mean big picture archetypes like aggro, mid-range, control, combo? Or did you mean smaller scale, more specific archetypes like red-green landfall and blue-white blink and red-black aristocrats?
Both, but definitely more the second one.
Yeah.
So I think that the way that archetypes come into play, and I think that this mostly just comes from the way that limited environments are designed, is that often new cube designers will approach a cube and say, well, okay, we have this idea of archetypes, these type of decks, and it sort of makes sense to plot them because we already have the structure of the color pie in all the different color pairs. So you'll say, well, my red-blue is focused on spells matter and prowess and things like that, and then maybe my red-black is focused on sacrifice, something like that. And through sort of constructing the set of archetypes, then cube designers will often try and fill up a cube that way as sort of a scaffolding to make it work.
Let's start with, why do you think Wizards of the Coast does that in their retail limited design?
So I think that their motivation is obviously pretty different, because we're kind of talking about there's going to be two different aspects of this experience that we're going to be talking about. One is the actual design experience that you're having as a cube designer, or potentially you're just going into a cube to play it, and it has these sort of defined archetypes. And obviously Wizards of the Coast, when they're designing limited sets, they're more focused on the actual play experience, right, as far as we're concerned. So I think the biggest thing for them is just making the draft format approachable and have some sort of like expectation setting. So when you're going into drafting a format, you can, especially see these gold uncommons and say, oh, that's the kind of thing I'm going to try and do in this set. So you can, just like we're talking about with us pack one, pick one, like find a path that makes sense. And hopefully if those archetypes are well balanced, end up not feeling like you're falling into a trap and you're doing the thing right. They're sort of holding your hand a little bit.
Yeah, I think of them basically purely as like bowling bumpers for new drafters, where if you're in a less experienced group, it's like, do you know how to draft? Do you know how to read signals? Do you know how to evaluate cards? Maybe if that stuff is a little bit new to you and foreign to you, what you can know is literally looking at what's written on the card. It says, like, take this thing with another kind of thing, basically. Like, if you look at a red-green card and it has landfall, and then there's a bunch of red and green cards that put more lands into play, it's not a huge leap to figure out that these cards are meant to go together. Whereas if you have an aggressive red 1-drop and a powerful red 5-drop or 6-drop, new players might not realize those actually don't go together, even in limited, the way that they might expect, because you don't want 1s and 6s in your same deck. And before you have those level up moments where you learn how to draft a deck in a more, sophisticated sounds judgmental. We learn how to draft a deck in a different way, valuing different things. It's much easier to have a foothold, basically, for people that haven't figured that out and can instead have a much more rigid and clear instruction for how to draft.
I would push back a little bit. I don't think it's quite bowling bumpers, because it's not just like, oh, okay, I am going to take the life gain cards in white and black, and now I'm just like completely on rails and I don't make any decisions. I think it's more just like a little bit of, like we call it a signal or a signpost. It's like, hey, this is a direction you can go in.
What's the distinction
I'm just pushing back a little bit, because I feel like you are saying a little bit like there are these archetypes which are like an explicit mechanic, like this color pair is all about landfall, which I think is maybe a little bit more narrow, especially like in a lot of limited environments. There still is a lot of depth to those that isn't just take these cards that are all about this one mechanic. I think actually Strixhaven recently was a really interesting example where the actual mechanic was spread throughout every single color and every color pair. Everybody was caring about Magecraft, or specifically they're caring about spell casting. But then what those different color pairs actually did with that spell casting, like what was the output of those, was different. So I think there can still be a lot of depth to that I just don't want to oversimplify.
Right. I'm not saying that it narrows the scope of what that deck can be, but I think when you are exploring that depth, you're inherently getting more familiar with the draft environment, and you no longer need that signpost. Now you just know how these decks work, and you know that even though this card is a very clear payoff for the life gain deck, it's not actually that good of a card. It's not very powerful, and so even though it has the mechanic written right on it, you actually skip that one over completely, and you take the generic removal spell or the generic 2-drop or whatever. So it's not that having these archetypes is necessarily makes them narrow, it's just that the reason Wizards does it is because I think it basically provides a foothold for people that haven't figured that out yet, or have not gotten to that point in their drafting career where they are comfortable looking at a pack of cards without any obvious signifiers and deciding on a direction.
Right. So do you think also that cube is different, or maybe I should say that limited design is different in that symmetry is more valuable in a limited environment, where they really want, either the 5 guilds or, in like a core set, all 10 color pairs to be theoretically draftable and balanced, whereas potentially in most cube designs, there's not quite as much the same priority.
I don't know. A lot of cube designers really want their environment to be balanced, and that's what they consider balanced. Like every color pair is draftable and viable.
Sure. I
personally don't care. Like I think maybe you're in the same boat where it's like, I don't particularly care if green black is not a combination that works in my environment necessarily. I want to make sure that I make my design decisions with that knowledge and know that, let's cut down on these green, black, gold cards, or acknowledge that the green, black, gold cards are going to go in a Sultai deck or whatever, and, make those plans accordingly. But I do think a lot of cube designers really want that symmetry, and their idea of a balanced cube is like there are 10 draftable 2-color decks, and they are all equally able to 3-0 or 0-3 a draft.
Right. I mean, I think that's sort of related to what I'm thinking. Like, you're potentially more willing to say mono green is viable, mono white is viable, and red, but potentially other monocolored decks are not going to happen. You're not going to be drafting mono blue in your cube. And I think that
I'm not going to be certain. If somebody is, I'm very curious to see how it goes for them.
So I think that both, like, it still sort of fits into that, like, making limited approachable, that you don't sort of need to come into a new format and sort of know, like, hey, these are colors that kind of work together, and these are colors that are, likely to be played in monocolored decks. You can kind of just say, like, well, I'm going to find 2 colors that are open, and I'll generally find a lane and have a functioning deck.
Well, that kind of gets to my next point about the difference here, I think, between Retail Limited and Cube when it comes to archetypes, which is that, to me, I think decks being 2 colors is almost a heuristic in Retail Limited. Like, I think the vast majority of successful decks in most Retail Limited sets are going to be 2 colors. If you set aside sets that are designed specifically to support monocolor and sets that are designed specifically to be tricolor and more, most core sets, you find the 2 open colors, you play it. Maybe open a bomb in a 3rd color and you make a greedy splash. But mana fixing is not great in those environments, and also card quality is not great. So you're not likely to get enough playables in 1 color to go monocolor, and you're not likely to get enough fixing to safely play 3 or 4 colors. And so you're kind of just, this sweet spot in Retail Limited is very often exactly 2 color decks, which I don't find that to be true in almost any cube environments. Most cubes I play, there's lots of viable monocolor decks. There's at least 1 3, 4, 5 color deck in the environment that's viable, and all different combinations in between. I don't find that cubes, for the most part, end up hewing to that strong heuristic of, like, most decks are 2 colors.
Do you think that so we're flip-flopping a little bit between what is the sort of design exercise versus the play exercise? Do you think it's...
Well, they're related, though.
They're definitely related. Do you think it's reasonable to say, like, well, if I'm interested in Limited, my, play group enjoys Limited, to design a format that plays in a similar way?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I just don't think most people have. I think most cubes that I've seen are not like Limited in the sense that they are strongly forcing 2-color decks, which kind of gets to my first observation, shall we say, criticism of archetype-driven design, which is that I think very often the cube designer's conception of the environment is that I have these 2-colored guilds all planned out with each with their archetype or their mechanic or whatever, and then somebody comes in and drafts 3 or 4 colors that just combines all the good cards and it does really well, and this person's like, crap, my cube is falling apart. And it's because I think a lot of times the archetype-driven designer is not thinking from the perspective of the player. They're just thinking from the perspective of a designer, and they have this matrix in their head of all these colors crossing, and they're trying to find these cards that are, overlapping between all these different archetypes. And if you do that to please your, like, design sensibilities, oftentimes you end up with an environment that doesn't actually play that way in reality. You can point to all the cards and say, clearly I have a red-green landfall archetype, but if that deck is not successful, you don't really have a red-green landfall archetype. You have a bunch of landfall cards that don't work together.
So you did just say, like, make 2 pretty big generalizations, and maybe that's exactly what your sort of conclusion is. You both said, in most cubes, that 2-color archetype isn't actually the best place to be from, like, an optimal play perspective. And you also said that most people come into cube trying to design that with that idea of archetypes and, like, balanced symmetry. And so is what you're saying the result of that is that people want that, but from a play perspective, that's not actually what happens?
Yeah, so just to be clear, like, I do think obviously 2-color decks work in most cubes. It's not that you have to be drafting monocolor or 3-color to have a successful deck. I just think the overall breakdown, like, if you looked at Retail Limited, I think it'd be like 85% of decks, maybe 90% of decks that are clean 2 colors or 2 colors with, like, a single splash or something. And in cubes, I feel like that number's, I don't know, closer to like 60%. And then you throw in some monocolor decks, some 3, 4, 5 color decks in there. It just feels like the tilt is nowhere near as strongly towards the guild pairs. Though obviously, as you said, you could make that a goal of your cube, that you really want 2-color decks to be the peak most performant decks, and 3 colors to be risky, and 1 color to be short on playables, and you just don't end up there. The other thing I said is that I do see a lot of new cube designers that, if I had a nickel for every time I looked at a subreddit post or a post in the Discord that was like, got my first cube design lists all laid out, my archetypes are blue, white, flicker, red, black, aristocrats. I mean, literally these exact archetypes. They list all the same examples we're giving.
Or I think
blue tempo, let's say red aggro or something. They list all these things which are like kind of canonically enshrined in like what the color pie is. Like if you're going to have a Spellslinger deck, Magic naturally is pushing that deck to be red-blue. You can, of course, design a Spellslinger deck in any kind of color pair you want. We've got enough payoffs in all these different colors over time that you can run against that grain, but the pool of cards is deepest, and what the colors naturally do in these specific ways. The mechanics do have color pie affiliations, and so oftentimes someone's like, I'm designing this cube, and here's my list of archetypes, and it's like, that's just... like
magic.
It means nothing to me. That's just magic. Like you've just listed these archetypes, and the fact that the person felt pressured to like figure out what their archetypes were going to be instead of just start putting cards that they wanted to play in an environment and like let those little like seed crystals branch off and like if I want to play this card, what other cards go well with it and what other cards are good against it and like let that kind of evolve naturally. I just find that approach ends up very often with an environment that the vision for the design is very divorced from the actual play experience because it was designed in this intellectual remove and not designed in the sense of like what is powerful in this environment and how do I make the thing that I want to be the theme of the environment or I think is fun the powerful thing to do.
I think the even more compelling examples of those kinds of questions are like, well, I'm new. Hello, I'm designing my first cube.
Is it your first day?
I'm designing my first cube, and I can't think of an archetype for, blue, white, and green, black.
Or, historically, like people will always say they can't think of an archetype for blue-green. Like, they would just always say that.
Right.
Like, what do I do? Like, I don't like +1/+1 counters. What's my blue-green archetype? I don't know what blue-green's supposed to do.
And that just sort of really, like, exemplifies or implies how much they're taking for granted that the way you design a cube is in the structure. But I don't want to just railroad in the structure, because I think that we should... really like highlight what does work about it, because I think that as a new cube designer, picking from all however many, what are we up to, like 24,000 Magic cards is a huge task, and there's a lot of different ways you can try and sort of break down and make that more reasonable, make those choices more manageable. Obviously, like the biggest things that we'll advocate for is just start with the cards and the mechanics that you like and find exciting.
Like what made you want to design a cube? Something tells me it wasn't because you really wanted to scrap and scrounge for those last 3 of the 10 archetypes that you
or
really
maybe
wanted
it
to
is pick. But I think that in addition to like choosing your favorite cards or taking these mechanics like we see in the face down slide, choosing like a full cycle of things does make that decision space a lot easier, just because you have more structure, and most likely if you have like really explicit mechanical archetypes, you are leveraging things that have been built into core sets repeatedly or things like that. So there's a clear expectation to how those decks will work, and you can leverage sort of that existing design from core sets or other sets that you enjoy, the color pairs that have a sort of explicit mechanical synergy. And I think then from the player experience, obviously I think you're totally right that a lot of times if you design a cube this way and you play test it the first time, it's very unlikely it's going to just work. And
which is true of any cube you design
absolutely.
for the first time.
Any goals you have. Time. I mean, people like to say, well, I'm going to design my cube, I'm going to build it, it's going to be perfect, and I'm never going to change it. So I hear this rarely.
I've never heard anyone say that.
I've definitely heard that this comes up. They're just like, yeah, I need my cube to be perfect before I start playtesting it. It's hard to get.
There's
to
definitely that pressure where people feel like, oh, I'm going to order these cards or I'm going to like buy all these sleeves for the first time. I don't want to like screw it up. And it's like, you're not going to, first of all, you're not going to screw it up. Magic's fun. Like it'll just be fun. You can play it. It's fine. But also you're not going to be 100% satisfied with it literally ever, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, saying I want it to be perfect before I playtest it is like saying I'm, catering a wedding for 200 people and I want to design my recipe perfectly before I ever cook it once, before I taste anything. Yeah. It's like actually testing it
before
to see how it works.
Food. I'm a baby.
It's just a critical piece to actually knowing if it works. So to that point, I think it also does make sense, depending on your play group, to have that as a, again, like in Limited, which I think you and I both enjoy, that kind of structured mechanical synergy to say, hey, I'm going to be able to just pick up this cube I've never seen before and not fall into traps immediately and have some sort of guide. I think for many...
Well, hold on a sec. Are those uncommon signpost cards, is that part of what you enjoy about Limited? Do you think those are for you?
Yeah, I think that they... Like, I think you have this idea that, those are the training wheels. Once you master it, you lose the training wheels, and now you're just taking the good things. But, like, I feel like going into the first draft, and honestly, a lot of the cubes I've played, I'm only playing a couple of times, like, with the exception of yours and mine and a couple people in our local group that, I've played dozens of times. A lot of times I'm only playing a cube a couple times. And in those cases, yeah, having it, like, be sort of clear and have some idea of what is happening, I think that is an asset.
But there's lots of ways to, I mean, now we're kind of getting confused with like just making your environment have signals and be draftable in a healthy way, period, which does not have to be at all related to two-color archetypes.
True. Man, I just wanted to get you to get on there is some value here before we take it apart.
There is value. Okay, here's the value in it. The value is, like you said, cube design is very difficult. And if this is the thing, if you are paralyzed with indecision and this is the thing that gets you over the hump to put some cards in a list and simulate a first couple drafts, then that is absolutely valuable in that sense. Like if that's what's going to get you over that hump. I've actually never designed a cube this way. And I've tried. I've said, so many people do this. Let me try to design a cube this way and see if I enjoy the process, see if I enjoy the result. And I really struggle because what ends up happening is that you basically you set yourself up for failure from the very start because the first thing you decide is what I think should be like the emergent last thing that comes out of a cube design. You decide like what these individual color pairs should want to do. And then from there, you set this goal of now I need to make all these color pairs equally supported. When you draft the deck successfully, those decks have to compete equally with each other. They have to like be equally as good, and you can't just have the blink deck always win all the time because then your cube is unbalanced. And you end up basically making the whole design process way more difficult for yourself than if you just started at the low level and said, like, here are cards I want to play. Here's what I'm excited about. Here's the reason I want to design this new cube, whether it's your first cube or your 15th cube. Here is the sort of thing that is inspiring me. And from there, work up and slowly arrive at what those color pairs want to actually be doing, if anything specifically. A lot of times, you don't need any kind of thematic mechanical thing to tie a color pair together, and it can still be drafted successfully, and it can still signal itself to your drafters, basically. It sounds so dismissive. Like, I don't mean to say that, like, you shouldn't have signpost cards in your guilds in your cube. You totally can. And I think if you do, then you're emulating limited in a very specific way, and other decisions should flow from that decision. But I don't think the signpost uncommons in cube are for you or me or anybody that drafts a set more than once or twice, basically, and has any experience. Because even if I take this signpost uncommon card, you're not just then going to take all the cards that synergize with it. You're going to take the good removal. You're going to take the bomb creature. You're going to take the things that you know as a drafter you're supposed to take. And the synergy that comes up later on is somewhat like incidental. Like that just happens to be what that deck is doing. It doesn't matter that it's lifelink specifically. It could have been +1/+1 counters, or could have been anything else. You just took a card that had a payoff, and that payoff comes together later on. If you're open to it, though, I think we should steer this conversation a little bit differently, because we're halfway through this episode, roughly, and I think we've only been talking about one very specific aspect of this, which is how the archetypes dictate how the cards end up in people's pools when they draft them, right? Like how the archetypes change the shape of the draft. And I do think that there's something to be said for the fact that introducing these kinds of archetypes changes to the decks you can draft in a much more fundamental way, where it's like a landfall deck has a texture to it that is different than just good red and green cards you put into a pile. A Spells Matter deck has a texture to it. It has a style of play that some people just like. And so I think a lot of times what cube designers end up doing is saying, I like this red-blue tempo deck. I like this red-green landfall deck. I like this red-black aristocrats deck. I've got 3 of my 7. Now let me fill in the rest of the other ones I think I like. And usually they get to like 7 or 8 before they're like, I don't like anything else. Now I have to just pick randomly basically for these last 2 archetypes. And I think what they should have done is said, I like these things. Just start there. I like this prowess deck, this sort of spell slinger deck. Go from that point. But it is relevant that these decks play very differently. So another reason to include archetypes in your cube is not just you want to send signals to your drafters. It's not just that you are having a hard time figuring out what cards to put in your cube list, and you need some way to make your Scryfall searches smaller so it's less time-consuming and overwhelming. It's also that you just like the way this deck plays, whether it's a constructed deck or a limited archetype you really like. You just like the way this deck plays, and so you want to capture the spirit of that deck in your cube.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. And really that just comes naturally from the color pie, because each color already functions in a different way. You mix any 2 colors together, you're going to get...
Well, they used to. Look, talk about this white card draw, am I right?
You're not wrong. And you get some new color. And like, to me, that's one of the most interesting, deep aspects of the game. Like,
for sure.
Obviously, the fact that, it's really actually awesome. I haven't had this experience in a long time, but when you talk to somebody who's used to like playing card games, like, bridge and poker, and you're like, oh yeah, here's this card game, but both players have a completely different deck and they can choose whatever cards they want. It's like, well, I'm just going to put all the best cards in my deck. It's
Clearly.
like, well, good thought, but there's like all this diversity in the way that you can build decks to different strategies. Like that is really the depth of the game, right? And like we very much take that for granted because it is
I'm just
fundamental.
imagining a Power Max poker deck now where like someone designs their own deck of playing cards to make the most powerful hands in poker possible. What would that look like? It's like half just aces. It's only...
I don't know enough about poker. I would assume all aces, but...
but then it's a tie all the time. You need some variation in there.
Right. I mean, we'll
talk about Power Maxing poker by designing your own poker decks later. That's an interesting thought experiment.
And I think that you're right. That is what Archetypes is. So yeah, I think I'll agree with you that the signposts are not there for me in the sense that I need it to, once I've drafted a format a dozen times, I don't still need that to tell me what to do. But if it's, Cloud Blazer and I love drafting this Blink deck, that's going to be a critical piece still in drafting a deck that has a specific texture. And I do think that's like a totally reasonable goal. If you want to say, I want to have 10 decks that play out differently, then, you can do that. So I think that there are some other really important limitations to that structure, though, that we're sort of getting to, is that if you have this like sort of structure of, I'm going to create these 10 different archetypes, they're all going to play very differently, then you can get into this difficult spot where you have all these cards that are dedicated just for one color pair, and the draft can feel less like, well, I'm making interesting decisions, I have a lot of agency, I'm choosing what direction I'm going into. And instead you get into this pattern of, well, I'm drafting the Spells Matter deck, so I'm just taking the Spells Matter payoffs and the spell cards, or I'm just taking the Blink cards and the ETB creatures. And I think that that's actually something that's easy to overstate. Like, I think that if you just put, your 10 archetypes together, again, it's going to be fun, at least for the first dozen times, but there is that potential for that kind of like on-rails draft where you end up just finding that lane and sticking to it. There's a really easy solution to this, though, if you do start to feel that happening. And again, I would just urge you to get to playtesting sooner rather than later and actually see if this is a problem rather than theorizing about it too much. But the easy solution is to try and create cards and choose themes that bridge each other very naturally. So you can still have these very different textures and the different kinds of decks that play out differently, but you have plenty of connective tissues so that you don't just have cards that only fit into one space. And it's really an interesting balance effect of you don't want cards necessarily that just every deck will play them, because then you're kind of losing agency in a different direction where you just take all the good cards and you end up with the good cards. So having some cards that explicitly don't fit into, like you're talking about, your 1-drops and your 6-drops, the fact that you specifically don't want them in the same deck is meaningful and creates the structure of the draft.
I hear you. I think there is basically no danger of people ever going to that extreme. I think it's essentially impossible. Magic is too much at odds with itself to say like, oh, this cube just has good cards in it, you just take good cards and have a deck. That's just not possible. Like, even if your cube is nothing but... I could say this from experience because my cube is so close to this, right? It's nothing but like efficient, flexible creatures that go in almost every deck, cantrips, counter spells, removal spells, ramp spells. It's like I have very few, very, very narrow cards that only fit in a specific strategy. But the way in which you combine these different fundamental effects and their densities and how your curve looks and all that kind of stuff is not it's not easy. It's not easy to do when the cube is full of good stuff cards. It still takes a ton of skill, and the resulting decks are not all the same. They're not all just good stuff piles. What you said is true. I have literally never seen a cube where like that actually was borne out. And I all the time see the far extreme of that, where somebody is so afraid of that they have put a bunch of very narrow signpost cards in that you just get late, and you're like, I can't play this card even though I'm in this color because I'm not the red artifact deck, I'm the red spells deck, and so this card is dead for me.
Yeah, that's fair.
Here's a question for you. Your cube takes a somewhat novel approach to these archetypes. In a sense, you don't, to my knowledge, have a idea of like, here's the 10 color pairs, here's which one I'm supposed to be doing. But you do have a lot of cards that archetypally driven designers oftentimes use as their signpost cards. You like gold cards, you like these kind of overlapping build-around-y like mechanics. You like the idea of a card dramatically changing your pick order when you take it early in the draft because it has this payoff or this build-around sort of aspect to it. Some people have accused you of essentially having these cards be traps in your cube because you don't go so far to say, like, all my green-white cards are landfall cards. So when you see a Knight of the Reliquary, someone might think landfall deck, and they just can't do that because your cube is not designed to support an all-in archetypal deck in any given color pair. But what do you say to that criticism?
I mean, I've seen more often the related criticism of just, oh, this is a theme cube where you have that archetype structure. And I think it's interesting, actually, just to give a little bit of context. Like, when I first started designing this cube, my first step was, let me pick a bunch of cards I like. Let's figure out what's interesting and appealing. But I definitely did have a step where I was like, okay, let's take this pile of mud that I've got, this like set of cards that I'm interested in.
Was it a puddle of mud, maybe?
No. It was what do you call it? A primal clay.
Clay statue?
It could be anything. It could be an 0-4 wall or a 2-2 flyer. Who knows? And so I did sort of take that and start culling it and sorting it and trying to figure out, are there themes? Or is there actually like some sensibility to the things that are interesting me that are not just pile of random cards? So I definitely had a phase where I was like, okay, well, let's add some more add some like fill in the blanks and try and reinforce this with themes. But after I had sort of that scaffolding, then I went back and said, okay, well, I don't want to just be, if you're drafting blue-red, you're always drafting the spells matter. I want there to be a little bit more texture, so I actively tried to, spread things across multiple colors so that you could be doing blue-white artifacts and also potentially blue-black artifacts, or both like different variations you can have. And in addition to that, adding as many of these bridge cards, like the kinds of things that, it's a creature that has an enter the battlefield effect that makes an artifact token. So if you care about tokens or creatures entering the battlefield or artifacts, there's a reason for you to care about this. Specifically with the reason that I just wanted to pack as much as I possibly could in terms of these potentially differently textured decks with just, the same number of cards. So having cards that could do double duty really supports that.
Now, what's the difference between a card that can do double duty and in a like strict mechanical sense, like this card references lands and it references plus and plus one counter,
the good stuff card,
versus just a card that is good enough to go in both those decks but doesn't care about the mechanic at all?
I think there's definitely a spectrum there, but the fact that I think some of those bridge cards still, like we're talking about, do not fit in some decks. So it's not that every deck wants it, but there's just like a meaningful chunk of decks. And that's pretty squishy, but I think that it does bear out in a lot of contexts. And then the related thing that's more to what you're talking about of these cards being traps, I also tried to keep all of those themes dialed in enough that you can't, there just aren't enough cards, outside of maybe some rotisserie drafts of an oversized cube that we've done, where you're just not going to be able to get enough cards to go all in on one theme, so that you're kind of forced to be straddling one or two. So you're going to have some spells, some artifacts, and how do you find those bridge cards that kind of make it make sense? And all of that to the goal of saying, hey, I really like these different textures, the different way these decks play, but I want them to also I want to maximize that diversity. So you're going to be trying a couple different combinations every time. And that does fail. I just recently had a really abysmal failure of trying to do a spells matter sacrifice Feldon deck, and it didn't quite work. I had sort of some of the package of, these things that make tokens with spells, and that tied in with the sacrifice, but I definitely stretched myself a bit too thin.
The other thing I guess I would say about archetypes in this arena of conversation is that I have often felt that an archetype can be felt with far fewer cards than cube designers seem to think, especially in a resulting deck. So if you take a deck that's 2 colors and you can compose it of 75% good stuff cards that have nothing to do with the mechanics specifically at hand. But if you have just 2 or 3 cards, especially if those 2 or 3 cards are how you're going to win the game, they're your like bombs, the top of your curve, they're the cards that combine together to do something powerful, you can really have a deck that feels thematic with almost no individual card support. Examples of this in my cube recently. We talked about Field of the Dead a couple weeks ago. It's a card I'm excited about right now. Just with Golos, Field of the Dead, and like Light of the Reliquary, that all of a sudden is like a lands deck. That is all you need in my cube. You can stick that into a like 3-color control shell or like a green-white ramp shell, and just like that becomes a landfall deck all of a sudden, because those cards are potent enough together that they essentially, that becomes your strategy, even though you don't have tons of landfall specific cards. And I think oftentimes people, in an attempt to really satisfy and scratch that itch of like, ooh, look, I found this bridge card, they like fill their cube with all these bridge cards that reference all these mechanics. But when you limit yourself so much that you're looking for those bridge cards, I think oftentimes things like power level have to be sacrificed, and you end up with cards of a wide variety of power levels, and maybe density of effects are not exactly what you want because you were really focused on these mechanical themes, and you end up with, I hate Charming Prince. I think that card's just Charming Prince and Mire Triton are these 2 cards that people are like, ooh, are these 2 cards that people really love because of these glue cards. They do like 4 different things, and I'm like, this card is bad at everything it does. Like, give me any just bread and butter decent white 2-drop instead of Charming Prince, and it will be better in the Flicker deck. It will be better in the Life Gain deck. It's better in the deck than Charming Prince is.
I'm with you on Charming Prince. I don't have a good reason. It just doesn't really... Well, no, I do. I don't like the card because just mechanically, all the things it does are just so disconnected. It's just sort of like soup.
It was made to be a glue card. It was made to be like a, look, I do multiple
But
things.
those are the kinds of glue cards where it's just like, hey, do A or B or C. It's like, oh, okay, that doesn't have a lot of soul or wit to it.
Yeah.
So I like Meyer Triton a lot more because it feels a lot more cohesive and connected.
I do like that it doesn't just have 3 modes on it. It says
Right.
choose the mode of this card that matters. But clearly I have a chip on my shoulder about archetype-driven design.
Clearly.
I do think it's also possible, like, to take either approach to cube design and end up at either endpoint. I think a lot of people take an archetype-driven approach and they end up with a quote-unquote good stuff cube because the archetypes are not quite balanced and people just kind of draft across the lines and do whatever they need to do to, like, get the most powerful cards in their deck to win the games, and that's fine. You can also take a more emergent design approach and still end up with an archetypally driven cube. The best example I can give of this is my combat trick cube, which is usually I don't get inspired by like a theme when I'm designing a cube. But the combat trick cube is specifically based around a like specific mechanic. I was like, can I make combat tricks playable and interesting to me, like at a high level, like the way I want to play combat tricks in an environment. Like it was basically a challenge of take a card type I historically don't like in cube and build a cube where I like those cards. And what does that take? And so what I started with this cube was just combat tricks. I put all the combat tricks I could think of in a big list and said, here are the good combat tricks I'd be interested in playing. And then I immediately said, what goes from that? What it comes naturally from combat tricks? And like the first thing is like heroic. You think combat tricks, you're like, all right, I'm going to target my creatures with a bunch of stuff. Let's get heroic cards in there. So you put heroic cards in and you do Scryfall searches for all the cards that have essentially heroic, but it's not labeled heroic. And you put all those good ones in there. And now you have the beginnings of like a little bit of a pillar. And then what else matters? Okay, well now if we have heroic, let's also throw in some Spellslinger payoffs for all these combat tricks. Combat tricks are instants and sorceries for the most part. And so if we put the Spell Matters payoffs in here, they will be good with this pool of cards I already am developing. I've got this pool of cards I know I want to play. What other cards fit in this environment? And it did the same thing, basically following the sort of breadcrumbs from things that were really close to combat tricks, like Heroic and Spellslinger, to things like +1/+1 counters and like Hardened Scales, to things like Power Matters. And eventually ended up at like the Death Shadow, Scourge of the Skyclaves, like pay your own lifestyle aggro deck, which you wouldn't ever have sat down and said, let me make the archetypes for my combat trick cube, and then you just choose Death Shadow. Because like that has nothing to do with combat tricks, seemingly. But it does have something to do with like a lot of the branching things that do have to do with combat tricks. And so you just have this kind of like web that you just keep going a step further until you've got everything filled out. And so now I have a cube that has like a hardcore Hardened Scales deck, has a hardcore Power Matters deck, a hardcore Heroic deck, a hardcore Spellslinger deck, a hardcore like Death Shadow deck. But I didn't sit down and say, these are my archetypes. I have to go make the deck to fill this out. Because I wouldn't have honestly come up with those archetypes, I don't think, unless I did it through that emergent design practice.
I think it's very interesting the way that you're describing this like emergent practice, or like, did you even describe it as top down or top?
The opposite, bottom up.
Bottom up. Like it feels like you're describing it almost in the inverse of the way that I imagine limited sets are actually designed, where they are like don't have the luxury of saying like, oh, I'm just going to pick cards I like, because it's like, no, you got to make brand new cards.
Yeah.
So like when they're designing new sets, they do start with the mechanics because they have to start with the themes. That's what building a new thing is, and that's where maybe Cube the comparing limited set design and cube design kind of does fall apart, where we can't really do the same thing, because if you say like, well, I want my heroic next to my artifacts matter, we don't have all the knobs. I mean, you can obviously, but if you're just choosing from existing cards, not customizing things,
you'll find a lot of holes.
You can't say, yeah, I need to fill this hole, or like this card needs an extra point of toughness to, balance out.
Right.
You don't necessarily have all those knobs, so we do kind of need to take a different approach.
And that's what I think is what it comes down to for me is the people pursuing this approach, I feel like they are influenced by that. I feel like they're influenced by knowing that that's how retail limited sets must be designed. Surely they have to sit down and say like, what's our story? In what they call vision design, that's what they do. They say, here's our major mechanics. Here's where we're going to start these pillars. We're going to plant these flags in the ground and then build the cards around them. But like you said, unless we're keeping with customs, which is a whole other conversation, we just can't do that. And so I think people adopt not only the approach of research and development at Wizards, because it's evident in the cards in the set, but they end up adopting the actual cards. Like you look at the actual way, like I think the Signpost Gold Uncommons are probably the things that are designed, I would hazard, earlier on in the design process. It's like, we know what our mechanics are going to be. Let's design these gold, Signpost cards so we have them and we can look at them and then design the rest of the cards around them. I'm sure they're tweaked later when they're rebalanced and they go to development and stuff, but I think all of that is a byproduct of a design process that to me does not make sense when you're working with a fixed pool of cards, and is kind of a trap just to end up spending a lot of time playing with and looking at cards that are maybe not relevant for your environment.
So I do think there's something that's shared very much between those two design experiences, which is iteration. I don't think, as much as they are, starting with themes first, I don't think that means that they choose the themes, and those are definitely the themes they end up with at the end of the design process.
It's definitely evolving.
So I think that iteration is definitely the same between both these processes, where you start with some idea, whether that's I want to explore this particular card type, this particular mechanic, or, this brand new mechanic. And then, you have to do some playtesting and decide, okay, well, we picked these 10 themes. This one's really not playing out well, so let's scrap it. Let's replace it. So the other thing that you touched on, though, that I think is really important is pointing out build-arounds. And I think that it's worth... I'm not as down on this whole idea of symmetrical archetypes, because even though I agree with you, it's a little bit fraught. There are a lot of challenges with it. And I would absolutely say to anybody who is designing a new cube that you absolutely do not have to do that. That is not a requirement. It is an option, and it's potentially useful scaffolding. But I do think that there are a lot of things that are sort of similar to this archetype design, or create some of this, solve some of those same goals in different ways that are worth touching on. I mean, one of them is just the variation of you don't have to have perfect symmetry. If you want to say this particular theme is in multiple colors, that's totally fine. Yeah. Or if through sort of an emergent iterative process like you're describing, you end up with 4 or 5 themes, but one of them is monocolored, one of them is a 3-colored slower deck, one of them is pretty narrow and focuses on a smaller card pool. That asymmetry is, I want to say it's totally fine. It's up to you whether or not it's totally fine, but...
well, you could say it's fine. It's definitely fine. There's nothing wrong with it. I would say it's mostly... It's very unlikely that I've seen people sit down and say, all right, here are my, guilds, here are my archetypes. I'm going to pick 5 cards in each color that are like for each archetype, and then like 3 gold cards in each color that are for each archetype. And if you set out with that plan, like, you are sacrificing a lot for that aesthetic balance. Like, there's no way that you're going to be able to get that exact symmetrical number of cards that are relevant in that specific way, that are all balanced on power level, that all make sense in your environment. Like, you're making other sacrifices that are invisible to you in order to satisfy that symmetry. It's the same thing there. If you imagine that all of these archetypes are neatly contained in exactly 2 colors, that is rarely going to make sense for the way the cards actually play out. Like in my own Pun Magic cube, I have Knight of the Reliquary, which I like primarily is just like a mid-range threat. I'm on double fetch lands now. You can just play a 3-mana 5/5 pretty often. It's just good in that sense. It's also there as a lands card. Again, given that I have almost no lands support, it's very, very few cards, but it actually does come up. And then I have a card like Ren and 6, which is also just there because it's just generically good. Like, it's a great card to play in like a low to the ground red-green deck, some kind of Jund deck or whatever. But you can combine those 2 cards, and now you have like a new thing. Like, individually, those are like only kind of lands cards. Like, they're both playable on their own. But when you put them together, they have this like synergy that makes them better than their... The whole they make is bigger than the sum of their parts, basically. And that is only because those cards are across 3 colors. There are not 2 green-white lands payoff cards that are capable of being combined in that powerful of a way.
Yeah, and something critical that you're getting at that is another question that I do actually see fairly often is how many cards do you need to support an archetype is a question. And that's
I'm saying 3
a really
minimum.
Fraught. I think that's a really fraught question.
If it's 2, it's a combo. If it's 3, it's an archetype.
Well, I don't know. But that is a very fraught question because archetypes are not all the same. So just like we're saying, hey, you can break sort of the symmetry in terms of where these things are, the symmetry is also going to be really hard to achieve because if you're trying to create the hardened scales deck, you need a really dense amount of +1/+1 counters and things to do with them for a build around like hardened scales to really make sense.
You can't take a 3-card package like Golos, Field of the Dead, Knight of the Reliquary, and make a hardened scales deck by taking hardened scales and any 2 other cards. It's just not possible.
Right.
You need way more of a density of that effect.
And yeah, similarly, you could have opposition, which is almost an archetype in itself. There's a shell of a deck that it kind of makes sense in, but it really enables this unique kind of play pattern. So the number of cards to support an archetype is just not an answerable question. But I think that there's still like exploring that nuance can really inform how you design a cube, because if you're bearing in mind how many cards does it take to support this particular archetype and considering everything from really linear decks that depend on a lot of similar cards to very small packages that support kind of an entire playstyle, then treating each of those with the respect and whatever card support they need on a case-by-case basis will sort of let you make things work a lot more smoothly.
I've also found that for me, very oftentimes the decks, the resulting decks of an environment play out much better. Even if you're adhering to a 2-color deck archetype style, they play out much better when the themes of the archetypes are much less blunt. An example of this is like I've seen cubes that have a like blue-green flash archetype, and that can be very naturally emergent just from saying green has a lot of flash threats, blue has some counter magic. Combine these things together, and I'm able to hold up counter magic and still develop my board, and that is a naturally good thing to do that just these colors kind of naturally combine to do. Versus putting the cards in your deck that say, like, I'm a green creature, and when you cast an instant on your opponent's turn, I get a +1/+1 counter. It's like those really, really blunt, limited things, like the flash creatures and the counter spells were already playable independently. You can put those flash creatures in your green deck, you can put those counter spells in any other blue deck, your blue-white control deck, and they combine to make a new deck. As soon as you take that green creature that says, whenever you cast a spell on your opponent's turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it, now it's just a card that you have included because you had a specific archetype in mind, and maybe you feel smart because you're like, here, this is a perfect card. I want my blue-green to be a flash deck, and so this card has got my cube written all over it. But in reality, it's just made the deck worse because now it's like narrower and only fits in that specific section, and the whole environment, I think, suffers because you've been very, very blunt with the mechanical themes. I think oftentimes the themes should be very nebulous and more broad than people often want to be, because they want to be able to describe them with one word and a mechanic. It's something recognizable to people.
Don't be hating on the blue Brineborn Cutthroat. Is there a green card that does the same thing?
I don't know. Maybe. Whatever.
So I have an issue with this. I feel like often we talk about, these mechanical themes, they're like a little bit too limited, too constrained. How much more limiting is a card like Brineborn Cutthroat that, yes, it says do the flash thing, versus like Kiki Jiki Pestermite? Like, I feel like there are such...
You love bringing up that example, but I don't play that combo. I'm not going to defend it. That's extremely narrow.
Do you not think that, but maybe not for you specifically, but I feel like from the general population, there is that like distaste for this sort of like explicit mechanics, while people sort of love these things that I think are equally as narrow, but they just don't... there's like some level of discovery to it.
I mean, if you want me to answer the question, I don't think it's comparable at all, because there's not like a 2-card combo with Brineborn Cutthroat that wins the game. Like, people don't like Kiki Jiki because it's a secret little thing. They like it because it's a powerful 2-card combo that wins the game. And some people have affection for it because they liked it in Modern before it got banned.
But I'm just saying that still, isn't there a similarity in terms of when you're actually drafting the deck, you're drafting the components that really specifically work together in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely dissect and disassemble the idea of drafting enough that everything's the same, man. This is where I put that Kanye quote I've included in like 9 episodes at this point.
Yeah, it's a good quote.
Everything in the world is exactly the same.
All right, great.
But yeah, I think it is different. And to me, it's like, I think ultimately it kind of comes down to this for me. Most people I talk with Cube about a lot, either in person or more likely on like the Discord community or whatever, or I see on Twitter or I follow on Twitter. I feel like most Cube designers can be put kind of roughly into 2 buckets. One bucket is a group of players that if somebody does something unfamiliar to them or they didn't plan in their cube, they're like excited by it. And like, that's cool. I had no idea. Tell me how that worked. Awesome. And a group of people that see that as a failure of their design and basically are of the opinion that they should know what all the draftable decks and all the draftable combinations in their cube are. That's their job as a cube designer. And I think a lot of that comes from this like unreasonable expectation that as the designer of the environment, you should have total control over it. And I think a lot of these archetype-based design decisions come from that. It's like, I should know what all the 2-color decks want to be doing, and because I'm the designer of the environment. I think it's totally fine to put some decks you want in an environment. Like, I listed off all those decks in my Combat Trick Minikube. I also have a modular deck which has popped up lately, which is kind of related to the Hardened Scales deck and has some other kind of connections. Sitting here today, I don't know what their color distributions are. I can't tell you if there's some color combination that doesn't have an archetype or whatever. I don't think that matters at all. I think it's perfectly fine to have a cube where I put cards that I think are balanced and work together in interact in interesting ways, and people do something I didn't expect and combine cards in ways I didn't foresee. I don't think people should have this pressure on themselves to basically have planned out the entire cube before they build it. Just put cards together. See what happens, man. It's magic. It's too hard to wrap your entire head around.
I think that's absolutely true. The expectation, I mean, similar to just the playtesting iteration, if that is the kind of gameplay that you want, it's going to take a lot of work. So use the structure if it's useful to you, but don't get married to it, and be willing to explore and see what players come up with is absolutely true.
Yeah. And I also think explore as a designer. Like, I don't know. Like I said, I would never have arrived at modular and Death Shadow aggro if I was like, let me make the combat trick cube. Those would not have been the things I would have picked for that. But they happen to work perfectly because I like took it one step at a time. And then every time you add a like batch of cards to your cube, I mean, you're going to get mad at me for saying this Heraclitus thing again, but it is now a new cube. It is not the same cube it was before. Every card you had previously ruled out or that you hadn't even bothered thinking about because it didn't fit, now might fit again. And so it's worthwhile to say, like, you know, when I added Field of the Dead, I said to you a couple weeks ago, I might put Primeval Titan back in because that's a card that's wasn't my cube a long time ago. It was outclassed and no longer good enough, and I felt was kind of a trap because people wanted to do broken banned card stuff, but it actually wasn't that great. Now my cube is different. I got a couple new cards in it. Now that card might be able to come back and have a totally different role in this environment. And so it's a different kind of ton of work, but it is a ton of work to reconsider everything every time you add a card or a package. So when I was building this combat trick cube, started with combat tricks, added the package of heroic, added the package of spells matter, which were the two most obvious ones to me, and then looked at those cards and said, what else fits here? Like if this is a puzzle that's starting to lay itself out, where else can I fill things in to like expand and make this interesting? And eventually you end up with stuff that like you can draft a modular hardened scales deck in that cube with no combat tricks in it. Like you don't have to even have a combat trick in your deck because the way that cube has evolved is we ended up in a place that's far enough from the initial seed idea that you have a new completely stable and independent archetype. To me, that's just the absolute best way to design a cube. And, you know, your mileage may vary. Maybe it's different for you, but I find all the time when people come and like list a bunch of archetypes that they are asking what I think are unproductive questions about how to figure out their environment.
To be fair, I think the first time we played the combat trick cube, I don't think a single combat trick was played.
Yeah, the first version had a few too many good removal spells
Instant
in it.
speed removal that kind of made it look not very appealing.
There were some combat tricks played. Those decks just did not win much.
I got to Cephalid Constable somebody.
That's something.
That was something.
That's something. What's your closing statement on archetypes, Anthony? I feel like maybe you had it a way you wanted this episode to go, and I derailed it with my...
I wouldn't say you derailed it. You just
With
sort
my
of blew
chip
up.
on my
You
shoulder.
blew up the rails.
Well, like you don't like drafting on rails. I don't like podcasting on rails. But what's your summary statement for archetype-driven design?
So my summary would just be that there is a reason that we have this archetype design, having, you know, things that are symmetrical and, you know, quote unquote balanced, and that symmetry is more about making the context understandable and easy to navigate more than anything else, I think. So I think that if that structure works for you as a cube designer, and if it works for your players as well, it's absolutely a reasonable starting point. But it is somewhat limiting because we don't necessarily have full control over the cards. We don't necessarily have full control over how all of these different mechanics interact with each other because of the limited card choices. So definitely be willing to see that as a starting point if that is something that makes sense to you, and be willing to, you know, spread archetypes across more colors, or, you know, leave gaps where things just don't make sense to you. Or you consider the fact that different archetypes come at different scales, and that maybe you can think more in terms of build-arounds and themes and packages, and actually get that balance not through the theoretical symmetry of the numbers of cards, but attain that balance through just iterating and seeing how the environment actually plays.
Yeah, I would say, you know, your archetype is not an archetype unless it can win, and the deck is draftable and winnable. And I see a lot of people that are trying so hard to force some archetype to work just by putting cards with the same rules text on them in a color pair. And that does not a deck make necessarily.
Yeah, it really doesn't. I think that is a very valuable distinction to make, that not every mechanic is an archetype. If you say, for example...
basically none are in my experience.
Well, there are some where if you put in more cards that have modular in the same deck, all those cards will work better together. It's like a very linear type of mechanic. If I put in more oppositions into my deck, there's diminishing returns, and
I've seen
keep
people
working.
ask, like, well, how do I have redundancy for opposition? And I'm like, you can run that Glare card. What is it?
Glare of Subdual.
Glare of Subdual. I'm like, you can run Glare of Subdual if you want, but also, like, I don't think you want redundancy for opposition, friend. I don't think that's what you should be aiming for here.
But critically, that there are a lot of things that, or maybe to take a different example with Flash, people will say, how many cards with Flash do I need before I am drafting a Flash deck? And it's like, I mean, those cards just work.
Stop
and you're
it.
not...
Stop it. Get some help.
It's not becoming
some
more
help.
synergistic. It's just... yes, they work with instants, but...
Look, my TLDR for this entire episode, if you ask me, like, what do I think about archetype-driven cube design, is honestly, don't do it. I think If you are asking, like, should I do this? No. If you have already done it because that was like the thing that was easy for you, or it comes so naturally to you that you haven't even thought to ask what you should do, then great. Like, that's a great way for it to be an on-ramp to design. But I think it is inherited from Magic R&D and largely applied inappropriately to how cubes most often play out.
Fair enough.
And on that bombshell, that's it for episode 71 of Lucky Paper Radio. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We do have to announce, Anthony, the winner of our pumpkin carving contest.
Is that over already?
The pumpkin carving contest is over. It is November 1st. There is no more Halloween. Look, we have to pick a winner, and Anthony and I were both enamored with Maramus, everyone's favorite pumpkin possum on the MTG Cube Talk Discord. Maramus carved a great Entomb pumpkin, which looks really, really good. So nice job, Maramus. I've already messaged Maramus to see if they would rather receive a jack-o'-lantern or send a jack-o'-lantern to put in the turbo cube. We'll find out what the answer is, and that'll be that's the bow on our pumpkin carving contest for this year. Good last-minute kind of impromptu idea, Anthony.
Yeah, that was fun. It's always fun to see people doing creative stuff.
It's true. All of our music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. And this show is produced by Anthony bringing a topic to the table and then me kind of screwing it up by being grumpy about it.
Finger painting's fun. Just get the paint.
It's a little finger painting.
Dump out the paint of the podcast. Mix it in with the chutney of chat. Sprinkle.
Look, the Abzan Hardened Scales
humor.
deck in my Combat Trick Cube is low-key busted. If you just lead on like Hardened Scales, Winding Constrictor, and Conclave, what's the Selesnya Winding Constrictor? Conclave Mentor. You just lead on those 3 cards, and then so many cards all of a sudden just become extraordinarily busted to cast. It's very satisfying.
Yeah.
Very satisfying. Then you hit him with a Dramoka's Command, put like 6 counters on 2 different creatures. Go nuts!
And then you put an Enduring Scale Lord out, and you put counters. You get a Juniper Order Ranger, right?
The thing is, low mana cost.
Yeah.
The cube has almost nothing above 3.